People today like to think of themselves as very modern. So increasingly, a 21st century mindset wants to leave behind the horrors of the last century and adopt very different social norms and standards. Just see how much we've progressed in recent times. We've got feminism and women's lib. Britain no longer has a systemic problem with racism, according to a recent government report on racial disparities. It's 20 years since the Netherlands became the first country to legalise same-sex marriage, and since then many other Western nations have followed suit. For the last decade, the Equality Act has been law in this country, making it illegal to discriminate against a whole bunch of protected characteristics that include disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. As a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, modern society, we are becoming increasingly tolerant of difference and diversity. Diversity and inclusion are the headline values of our society. So much so that increasingly judgment is being frowned upon. Because a tolerant society tolerates almost anything except intolerance. When everyone gets to be whoever they want to be and do whatever they want to do so long as it doesn't hurt anybody else, well, who are you to decide that certain attitudes or behaviours are right or wrong? Sure, you're entitled to your own version of the truth, but don't try and force that version of your truth onto somebody else, because they're just as much entitled to their version of the truth as you are yours. And so making statements about other people's lifestyles or behaviours has become almost entirely socially unacceptable in our day. And so today's section of Jesus' teaching that we know as the Sermon on the Mount is surely very relevant and up to date. Because here in the opening verses of Matthew chapter 7, Jesus encourages his disciples not to judge others. Many modern progressives have read these words and have celebrated them. Yay! Jesus himself condemns our judgment. How dare we judge anybody else if Jesus forbids it? Well, if that's how you're reading these words this morning, then I think you're in for a bit of a shock. These verses are a far cry from being an out-and-out condemnation of our judgment. We'll work through that and hopefully understand exactly what Jesus is instructing us to do and what not to do in a couple of minutes. And then we'll deal with that seemingly unconnected, perhaps even a little bizarre verse at the end of the passage, verse 6. Contrary to what some people think, that's not a different topic at all. Actually, it fits right into verses 1 to 5, as we'll see. So, here in these 6 verses, Jesus is warning his disciples about 2 dangerous behaviours that he wants us to avoid. They are opposite dangers. As so much of the Christian life, there is danger in swinging to either of the extremes. Jesus wants us to walk the middle ground between these 2 opposite errors. It's a bit like walking on a mountain ridge. If you've ever been on or you've seen pictures of Sharp Edge or Striding Edge in the lakes, or the even more magnificent Crib Goch on Snowdon, you'll know that walking a ridge needs careful footing and balance. If you deviate too far to the left or to the right, well then disaster awaits. Carefully walking the centre path is the only safe route. And none of us wants to fall off a mountain, do we? So let's not fall off the path in life either. And it's like this with judging, says Jesus. There are two dangers to avoid. So let's look, first of all, at the first danger. We must avoid the danger of being judgmental. The danger of being judgmental. Well, on the face of it, these words seem pretty obvious, don't they? Verse 1, you can't get more emphatic than verse 1, can you? Do not judge, or you too will be judged. Well, as I intimated in my introduction, Jesus is not banning all judgment here. If Jesus was to do that, he would be self-contradictory. He would be saying something contrary to what he says in other places. In fact, you don't have to look very far to find Jesus suggesting that we need to judge. Run your eyes just a few verses down the page and look at verses 15 to 20 of chapter 7 of Matthew. Jesus there warns about the dangers of false teachers. He says, we will recognize them by their fruit. And that just as a diseased tree is good for nothing but burning in the fire, that's pretty judgmental, isn't it? This tree, got to burn it. So it is with the false teachers who are to be spurned and avoided. Now, if Jesus is telling us to weigh up their teaching, and then if they teach false truths, to avoid them, well, that's judging people by a certain measure and taking appropriate action. So Jesus wants us to judge in that situation. And there are similar instructions to make a right judgment in many New Testament scriptures, not least in John's letters, which we looked at last year. Many, many times, John encourages us to measure things and to reject falsehood. Or take the subject of church discipline, where a disciple of Jesus is behaving in a way that denies the faith. And later on in Matthew, in chapter 18, Jesus instructs us that in such cases it is vital that we judge the person by exercising church discipline. Not to do so would be a mockery of the church. So anybody who reads the words, judge not, or you too will be judged, and understands them to be a blanket ban on any form of correction or judgment, misunderstands Jesus. The instruction here isn't to prevent any kind of judgment at all. So what is Jesus teaching here? It's the age-old danger of extremes. So, drinking water is good for you, especially when it's hot. Remember, boys, take a drink of water when it's hot. It's nice, isn't it? If you don't drink water when it's very hot, you'll get dehydrated and eventually you would die. But drinking too much water is also bad for you. People have actually died from drinking too much water because it actually dilutes your electrolytes and causes your cells to swell. And one or two people eventually have gone into a coma and ultimately died. Now, you'd have to drink an awful lot of water to do that to you. But the extremes are bad. Not drinking any water is bad. Drinking so much water that you go into a coma is bad. You have to drink just the right amount of water. Walk the centre ground and avoid the extremes. It's the same with judging people. A little discernment is a great way to live. In fact, Jesus encourages it. But Jesus knows our hearts. He knows that you and I are just like the Pharisees. So we so easily lose our balance and swing to one extreme or the other. We don't know when to stop. Our hearts soon start judging people for anything and everything that they do. Because we're self-righteous by nature, because I think I'm okay, we start to use our rules, our standards, to judge other people's behaviour. And then we start to condemn them. Before I know it, I've got a judgmental attitude to pretty much everything and everyone who differs from what I think and do. Because, well, obviously I've got it right, haven't I? And everybody else has got failings. Does your heart do that as well? Our hearts are that way because we are all tainted by sin, ruled by our own standards, ruined by our rebellion against God's rules and his claim on our lives. Our problem is us. And unless and until we recognise this, we've got no hope of changing. But there is good news for lost sinners with broken, selfish, self-righteous hearts. Jesus offers a new life, new hope, new hearts to those who follow him. That's step one of the recovery. So if you can see that you have a problem with your heart, come to Jesus first and let him give you a new heart. Even for disciples of Jesus, though, sin remains and our hearts can easily revert back to our old behaviours. Have you seen that in your tendency for your heart to nitpick the behaviour of others, even other Christians? For some of us, it will be other people's attitude to timekeeping, or perhaps it will be being critical of their inflexibility. Certainly, we can all be critical and judgmental of our government, can't we? Or maybe the opposition parties. Or maybe we're judgmental of our teachers. Or, dare I say this, maybe we're even judgmental of our mums and dads. We all need to watch our hearts. Because this capability of judging other people lurks not very far under the surface. We are masters of seeing issues in other people's lives and not our own. And so why is having such a judgmental attitude to other people's mistakes wrong? Well, verse 2 tells us, "For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." When we judge other people like this, in this self-righteous, condemnatory way, we actually usurp the place of God. God is the ultimate judge of all people, not you and me. So inappropriate is it for us to use our standards to judge other people that Jesus here warns that if we do so, God will use our standards to judge us. And we can't even keep our own standards, can we? So, if you judge others like that, you're judging yourself. It would be fine, wouldn't it, if we could apply our own standards of judgment to ourselves, but we can't. We've all got a self-serving streak in us. Our sin makes excuses for our behaviour, and we all self-justify. The speed that you drive down the motorway is the right speed. Everybody else going faster than you is a speed maniac, and all the people going slower than you are slow coaches. But you're going at the right speed. Friends, don't condemn yourselves to God's judgment by being critically, harshly judgmental of other people's lives. Jesus illustrates his point here brilliantly, graphically, in verses 3 to 5. So, likely drawn from his own experience, you can bet that somebody who grew up in a carpenter's shop knows the sensitivity of the eye to getting a piece of sawdust in it. I was cutting some wood yesterday, and the wind kept blowing the sawdust into my eyes. And I thought, this is really unpleasant. But we're fixated, aren't we, by the tiny imperfections in other people's lives. And yet we're blind to the errors of our own ways. Do you know, we are just like King David in the Old Testament, from the passage that Francine read to us. Blind to our own faults and obsessed with judging and correcting the errors in other people. But that itself brings a judgment from Jesus' lips. It makes us hypocrites. In fact, hypocrisy is a common theme in the Sermon on the Mount. Do you remember back to Mark's sermon? We're hypocritical when giving, when praying, when fasting. And now too, we're hypocritical when judging. Jesus is opening up our hearts and showing us just how nasty our hearts are. It seems we're incapable of being around others without needing to show off that our lives are better than theirs. We hide the real us and project a better version to the outside world. Well, at least that's what my heart does. Does your heart do the same? The word hypocrite comes from an actor wearing a mask, not a mouth covering like we've been doing for COVID, but the mask of performance when an actor portrays being a different character. In front of other people, we're all trying to be somebody we're not. And do you know what? That stinks. Jesus is calling us to live authentic lives with each other, to be vulnerable and real with each other. Now, don't think that Jesus isn't interested in us challenging each other about our sin. He absolutely is. He wants his disciples to care for one another, to help each other with problem behaviours and attitudes when we see them in other disciples. Jesus here forbids carping criticism and hypocrisy, not humble, gentle, practical, generous assistance with other people's problems. Once we renounce the role of God to judge the lives of others, and when we have grappled first and foremost with our own sins, then Jesus here in verse 5 positively encourages you to take an active role in helping your brother and sister in the faith to sort out issues in their lives. Deal with your own sin first, and then you're in a position to help others with their sins. As Don Carson, in his commentary, helpfully puts it, in the brotherhood of Jesus' disciples, censorious critics are unhelpful. But when a brother in a meek and a self-judging spirit removes the log in his own eye, he still has the responsibility of helping his brother remove his speck. So, disciples, how are you doing in this matter? Jesus lays on you the responsibility of removing your own logs, so to speak. You need to be working on cleaning the sins from your life, just as we labour at this time of year to spring clean our homes. You don't spring clean a home by casually moving a duster around the edges of the furniture for a few minutes. Spring cleaning is hard work, yeah? Hard work. You've got to move furniture, you've got to remove rugs, you've got to get into all the nooks and crannies. It's hard, tiring work. You get dirty and sweaty. It's unpleasant. It's tiresome. But it's necessary if our homes are to be clean. So too with our lives and hearts. It's hard, tiring, messy work to spring clean a life of sin. Are you getting stuck in to the spring cleaning of your heart? Or to return to Jesus' own illustration, it's painful to do eye surgery. The eye is a really sensitive part of the body. And eye surgery to remove logs, to remove sins, well, it's going to hurt. I got an eyelash in my eye the other day, and I was trying to get it out. And I was messing around with my eye and blinking and scraping. And by the time I'd finished, my eye was red and hurt. Your eye is sensitive. And we're going to think, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to do that work. But it's essential if we are ever going to be fit to help our brothers and sisters with their sins. And then, are you committing to helping out the others here in Spen Valley Church? Only in a meek, gentle way for sure, but Jesus clearly asks us to get involved with helping each other remove sin from our lives. I've quoted it before, but it's far too good, far too radical not to quote it again at this point. In the book Compelling Community that the men have been reading together, it says this: when we commit to a local church, we hand to other believers the authority to instruct us on how we should live our lives. For sure, we must yield that authority with care and gentleness and without hypocrisy. For that's what Jesus says we must do. That's the danger of being judgmental. Harsh, carping criticism. Using better standards for others than we use for ourselves. Avoid it, says Jesus. It's dangerous. However, don't so overthink this danger that you recoil from ever having any discernment at all. That too would be wrong. Whilst Jesus tells us not to be hypocritical, he never tells us not to be discriminating. That's what verse 6 is for. And so this is the second danger to avoid. The danger of being undiscerning. The danger of being undiscerning. Here again, Jesus uses a striking illustration to portray his point. Have you ever wondered why preachers use so many illustrations in their sermons? Well, it's because the master who they follow did so. Here the point is double-barreled, as much of the Hebrew poetry is. Two statements in parallel that express the same truth. So we've got holy things not being thrown to dogs, and we've got pearls not being thrown to pigs. The outcome is extremely unpleasant when they turn on us and attack us. And if that's a strange thought for you, well, remember that Jesus is speaking in first century Palestine. So the dogs weren't really domesticated. Think a pack of hungry wolves or hyenas. And for pigs, we're not talking about the modern bacon breed. For pigs, think wild hogs with tusks that rampage through a field and destroy the crops. You wouldn't want to mess with a pack of wild dogs, would you? Or a pack of wild hogs. Both are unpleasant. Avoid them at all costs. So Jesus here is referring to the Christian message, which is holy and can be likened indeed to pearls. In fact, Jesus explicitly uses the image of a pearl that represents the gospel later on in chapter 13 of Matthew. The pigs and the dogs represent different people groups who are frequently hostile to the Christian message. Here Jesus warns his disciples that especially and specifically in regard to the gospel message, we are to be discerning about how different people receive it. So, in life, we don't treat everyone identically. We just don't, do we? We take an interest in people. We listen to what they say. We respond appropriately. We measure people and we take account of who they are. And in a similar way, we shouldn't just identically respond to everybody with the Christian message. We must be similarly discerning in our witness and our evangelism. Some people will be a long way off from the kingdom of heaven. And in your dealings, in your interactions with them, you will be sowing seeds. Other people will be much closer to the kingdom. And you might be explaining detailed gospel concepts to them, and maybe even challenging them to commit their life to Christ. How weird would it be in life if we were mechanistic and robotic with everybody we met and we just said the same thing to everyone? Wouldn't be normal. And we'd certainly not have any lasting relationships with anybody. And so too it is with the gospel. We can't just spout Bible verses or trite Christian responses and expect people to grow in their knowledge of the faith. Everyone you meet will be in a different place regarding the gospel. Some will be closed to the truth and outrightly hostile to it. Others will be open, willing to listen, hungry for spiritual food. What Jesus is saying here is discern where somebody is regarding spiritual truth and respond to their needs accordingly. And do not be surprised if those who are hostile to the Christian message take offence when you continue to press the gospel on them. Because why wouldn't they? So Jesus warns us not to. That's perhaps not what we expected Jesus to say, is it? But Jesus often surprises us with his statements. He was, after all, the wisest person who ever lived. In fact, Jesus himself uses that measure with some and refuses to answer their questions or refuses to give them the gospel. So, today we've seen two dangers for us to avoid. On the one hand, avoid censorious, hypocritical judgment of others. Judgment that exposes the hypocrisy of our self-justifying hearts. It's ugly. It has no place in the Christian life. On the other hand, be discerning of people where the gospel is concerned, that you might focus your time and your energies not on those who are publicly hostile to the truth, but on those who are open to the message, to those who are seeking truth and who will listen to your testimony. Both our interactions with outsiders and our dealings with other Christians in the church are better when we have first cleaned our own hearts, when we have done that painful but necessary eye surgery. Get that plank out. Is there some eye surgery that you know you need to do in your life, but you've been putting it off because it's uncomfortable and unpleasant? Jesus says, now is the time to sort it out. Can you commit today to a rigorous self-audit, to a determination no matter how painful, to remove that log from your own eye, that you might grow in humility, in gentleness, in godliness, so that you can be a real practical assistance to your brother and sister here in Spen Valley Church.